At the start, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which you are all meeting, which are the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples. As I am still in New York, but will be back next week, I acknowledge the Lenape people, who are the traditional owners of New York City, and pay my respects, and on behalf of the committee, our respects to their ancestors and elders, past, present and emerging, and extend this respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and their cultural and spiritual connections to Australia's and New York's lands and waters. I declare open this public hearing of the Standing Committee on Social Policy and Legal Affairs, inquiry into online gambling and its impacts on those experiencing gambling harm. As you all know, this committee is examining whether current laws, regulations, consumer protections and education and support programs are enough to reduce harm to gamblers. This is the inquiry's first public hearing. Today, the committee will hear from the Department of Social Services, who we may refer to as DSS, about the current legislative and policy framework for online gambling in Australia. DSS shares responsibility for online gambling harm minimisation with the states and territories, including through the National Consumer Protection Framework for Online Wagering. The national framework consists of 10 agreed consumer protection measures that are being progressively introduced. DSS also administers the Gambling Measures Act, which enables measures that aim to reduce gambling harm. In accordance with the committee's resolution of 10 August 2022, this hearing will be broadcast on the Parliament's website, and the proof and official transcripts of proceedings will be published on the inquiry website. Those present here today are advised that filming and recording are permitted during the hearing. I remind members of the media who may be present or listening on the web of the need to fairly and accurately report the proceedings of the committee. I now invite members of the committee to introduce yourselves, starting with the Deputy Chair. Oh, I should say hello, I'm the Chair, Peter Murphy, Member for Dunkley. Deputy Chair.
Thank you very much, Chair. Pat Conahan, Member for Cowper.
Jenny Ware, Member for Hughes.
Keith Wallahan, Member for Menzies.
Louise Miller-Frost, Member for Boothby.
Thank you very much, everyone. So I now welcome representatives of the Department of Social Services to give evidence today. For the Hansard record, would you please state your full name and the capacity in which you appear before the committee?
Liz Hefferweb, Deputy Secretary Families and Communities, Department of Social Services.
Patrick Burford, Group Manager of Communities with the Department of Social Services.
Chris D'Souza, Branch Manager, Financial Wellbeing, Department of Social Services.
Thank you very much. Lovely to see you all. Not on individual screens for me and not on screens at all for everyone else in the committee this time. As I'm sure you are all aware, although the committee does not require you to give evidence under oath, I should advise you that this hearing is a legal proceeding of the Parliament and therefore has the same standing as proceedings of the respective houses. The giving of false or misleading evidence is a serious matter and may be regarded as a contempt of Parliament. The evidence given today will be recorded by Hansard and attracts parliamentary privilege. I want to invite you to give an opening statement before we proceed to discussion, and just let you know that we will be sharing questions across the members of the committee. Thank you very much for your detailed submission. While I'm inviting you to make an opening statement, I will urge you to make it relatively short. Much of the material is in the submission that you made, and I think it would be great if we have as much time as possible for committee members' questions. So thank you, witnesses. Over to you.
Thank you, Chair, and I will make it very short. I wasn't planning to make an opening statement, but I will just join you in acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands we're on. Thank you. I'm happy to take questions.
Terrific. All right, as the Chair, I'm going to start, but let me just put the timer on myself so that I don't go for too long. I don't know what time it's going to make when it goes off, so I apologise in advance if it's Beyonce or something. As I said, thank you very much for your submission. I've got a few questions that don't necessarily relate to each other. They're just individual points that I was hoping to get clarified as we went along. DSS administers the Gambling Measures Act, which has some harm reduction measures in it, such as voluntary pre-commitment on electronic gaming machines. Now, I'm correct that that's voluntary pre-commitment on pokies, on poker machines, is that right?
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. And there's currently nothing in the legislative scheme for voluntary or otherwise pre-commitment on online gambling.
That's correct, Chair. That's where the Consumer Protection Framework comes into effect.
Yes, but it's not in the Consumer Protection
not.
Framework, is it?
For pre-commitment, it is, Chair.
It is?
Yes, correct.
Right. And what does that mean? It's in the Consumer Protection Framework.
So the Consumer Protection Framework is for the online wagering side of gambling, and there's one of the 10 measures under the Consumer Protection Framework is for pre-commitment, a voluntary pre-commitment for all wagering providers, service providers to have voluntary pre-commitment offerings.
And has that
That's been
been
implemented.
introduced? Is that in place?
That's in place, Chair. Correct.
Chair, that was
So
implemented.
all online gambling providers have voluntary pre-commitment
Correct.
available?
Correct.
But it's not legislatively mandated, whereas it is for poker machines?
Correct.
Okay. And it's one of the suggestions that CSS has at page 2 that arose out of a behavioural trial in 2022 of the voluntary opt-out pre-commitment scheme. It came up with a range of further opportunities to minimise harm. Is that right?
That's correct. Sorry, Chair, that's correct. And so there's been the Implementation Government Committee will be looking to do a further review of what next from pre-commitment following the implementation of the remaining measures from under the Consumer Protection Framework.
So under the current timeline, that's not going to happen until after the review, which is 6 months following the final implementation of the measures of the National Framework, which is at the earliest the end of March next year.
That's correct, Chair.
And then there'll be more work done
That's
to
right.
decide whether, right,
Yep.
under the current timeline at least anyway. Look, just while I'm asking you about those options to minimise harm that came out of that study, and I know that we'll have other witnesses who are experts about harm reduction who will talk about moving to a public health model or a public health approach, and that was one of the recommendations from this study as well. Can you say from the department's perspective, like what is it that is different about a public health approach to the approach that's taken at the moment to harm reduction for online gambling at the national level?
So, Chair, I guess the public health approach in general means you take a kind of population-wide approach to the issue, and you focus on prevention more significantly. So rather than waiting until gambling problems emerge, you focus on, we want to prevent people even getting towards this kind of model.
Yeah.
So the most sort of significant kind of an equivalent area is I look after domestic violence programs and policies, and we talk about a public health approach as in we do a lot of work around respect and so forth to sort of change cultural attitudes, change beliefs, so that you prevent the harm from occurring. I think the people who are calling for a public health approach would say we're not, as a nation, perhaps doing a lot from preventing people experiencing gambling harm, and once they're there, we respond and support them. But it's shifting, I suppose, the emphasis of policy and program activity. I mean, some of the, sorry, Chair, some of the...
No, I interrupted you, keep going.
some of the measures in the Consumer Protection Framework they are designed to prevent people gambling escalating into problem gambling. So I think we're kind of on the track of a public health approach, but we don't have a population-wide, series of kind of public campaigns or focus on education in schools and so forth. So I think that's what they're getting at.
So can I suggest, and tell me whether you agree with this or not, at the national level, we don't have a considered, planned public health strategy. We might have some measures that you might say broadly fall under what might come in a public health strategy, but that's not the framework within which harm reduction at the national level is currently developed and delivered.
I think that's a fair comment, yes.
And I know that at the national level there is Commonwealth funding for financial services, and I'm not minimising the importance of that at all, but that's of course one of the financial one of the harms of problem gambling. But that's not a service that goes to perhaps the heart of why someone is experiencing harm from gambling. And anything else which is in the education prevention base is delivered by state. Is that right?
I just missed the end of your last sentence.
Oh, sorry. Any other programs or strategies or approaches that go to prevention, education, early intervention are delivered by states?
Yes, that's correct, but I'm not sure that you would say that there's an extensive range of prevention activities occurring even within states.
Well, that's my next question. Do we know what is being delivered by each state? Do we know what the impact of any of those sorts of programs are? Do we know whether any of the states currently have a public health framework in which they deliver those services?
I might ask my...
There are three questions there, but you know what I'm getting at.
Yes, yes.
So, Chair, I'm not aware of the details of within the states, but there is the Gambling Help Online service, which is an MOU between states and territories and the Commonwealth, and we do contribute, the Commonwealth does contribute some money to that, and that beyond the measures under the framework and the Gambling Help Online, which provides direction to various services, that's I suppose the extent to which I'm aware.
So we can compare it to the domestic violence strategy, the national strategy, which was just mentioned, and say that when it comes to addressing harm from problem gambling, we don't have that same robust national strategy which coordinates with the states about what's happening and how it's happening.
I think that's right. And I mean, domestic violence may not be the best parallel. Alcohol would be another parallel where, because, I mean, for domestic violence, there's no acceptable amount of domestic violence, but gambling and consumption of alcohol are legal behaviours. And so I guess, we've all seen, many kind of alcohol campaigns. There's alcohol education, occurs for young people.
Yeah.
There's a range of sort of strategies in place at Commonwealth and state level. So I think that might be a useful comparator, and noting that gambling is an addictive behaviour just as alcohol is an addictive behaviour.
No, thank you. I appreciate that. No, I certainly wasn't equating the two. But
No. It occurred to me after I'd said it.
Sorry, let me just stop. That was my timer. I can't believe 10 minutes have gone already. If there's time, I'll come back and have a bunch more questions, but I can put them on notice if my colleagues don't cover them. I will hand over now to the Deputy Chair and we'll start the time politely.
Thank you, Chair. Ms. Heffron-Webb, I actually think your analogy with domestic violence was accurate in terms of the comparison to the strategy and the funding. Being the Assistant Shadow Minister for Prevention of Family Violence, what we're seeing is really a back-end loading of funding to try and clean up the mess for support services, rather than front-end loading for prevention. Was that what you were trying to get at?
That is what I was trying to get at. So yes, we fund financial counselling support for people. The states fund helplines, and we make a contribution to those. So we deal with problem gambling when it's reached, crisis point for people. But there is not a national strategy around prevention. Yeah,
I understood that when you said it. Look, social services, your department is extremely broad. There is a lot in it, and I get the feeling you're sitting there today thinking this only forms a tiny part of what we do. Would I be correct in saying that?
Yes, it's an important part, but it is not a large number of staff within the department. Yeah. It's one section within Mr. D'Souza's branch, essentially, does all the work on this. So yes, and so that's like 5 people out of 1,500 staff or something that I have.
That's where I'm leading to. Yeah. How much of your time would be spent, and you can each individually answer this question if you might, how much of your time would you dedicate to this specific area, the terms of reference, particularly examining the adequacies of the legislation to protect people from online gambling and gambling harm?
It's hard to quantify, but...
well, if I can put it in this terms, very little, a lot.
Little. Just in the scheme of the extent of my responsibilities.
And please, I'm not being critical,
no,
and I appreciate your honest answer.
Yeah.
I'll say a little bit more than the little, because as you'll come down the hierarchy there, and not a seasonality to it, but in terms of point in times of implementation, we've got 3 significant measures still to implement, and as you would have noted in the media and statements, the consistent gambling messaging has been an important reform, and that's taking up probably a bit more than usual of our the time out of our days in terms of ensuring we're doing the consultation with industry and landing that one. So, in recent times, quite a bit more than would be normal.
Mm-hmm. Mr. D'Souza?
Naturally, my time tapers up as we go down. But I suppose because it's one section within 5 sections within my branch, and so I suppose focusing on the 10 measures and implementing those, but also, as Ms. Heffron-Webb said, I also have responsibility for government's financial wellbeing and capability service, which has financial counselling in it and problem gambling financial counselling. So, in that extent, I'm dealing with a program that sees as a response mechanism to some of these problem gambling customers.
So if we were to develop a national strategy for prevention, would that fall under your ambit or the whole of social services?
So depending on how it was organised and how large, yes, it would fall under Mr. D'Souza's ambit, but, potentially, as we have with domestic violence, we ended up setting up its own division because the work was so extensive. So we would obviously, if that was something that the government wished to implement, that's something we would respond to, and how we arrange our resourcing.
Yeah. Well, we're being told in your report that Australia has the highest gambling losses per capita in the world, $1,300 per adult in 2018-2019. totaling more than $25 billion. So we're the worst in the world. I shouldn't say we're the biggest losers, gambling, but we're the worst in the world. Surely we need this national strategy. Do you have the structure, do you have the resources to address what should be really a national shame?
So I guess I'd respond by saying we have the resources to deliver the activities we've currently been asked to deliver by government. If that was to significantly ramp up, we would need to adjust I would need to adjust internally the amount of resourcing going to this type of activity, and that's what we would do. So
you require desire and direction by government to address this problem.
So we, as you said, social services has an extremely broad remit. We respond to the direction of the government of the day in terms of how many resources we need for particular issues to implement their agenda and to respond to the community. So we will always have a capability, but the size of it will be dependent on the particular strategy or direction of the government.
Okay, thank you. And just finally, whilst this inquiry is generally online, one of the biggest complaints I get is gambling advertising on TV between 6:30 and 8:30, whether it's about football, racing, etc., etc. Those rules and regulations are imposed by the states and territories, is that correct?
I believe it's the responsibility of communications, is that right?
Right, so it's under
So it's federal.
Okay.
Yes.
So do you have any control or purview over what you can do or what the social services can do in that area?
We do not have powers to regulate advertising. That sits with the Department of Communications, who I think will probably be coming to talk to you. What we have a role in is the extent to which advertising causes harm. We suggest strategies and work with our colleagues at Communications. So the taglines, for example, are an example of that.
So the Department of Social Services implemented those taglines?
Correct, yes.
Right. And how much consultation was involved in preparing those taglines? Who did you speak to, over what period of time, and what methods were used?
I might ask my colleagues to speak to this.
And I'll
Thanks.
ask
Mr D'Souza to go into some more detail. The consultation for the development of the taglines were done in 3 phases of research, involving a total of 8,300 individuals. First part was behavioural research conducted by Central Queensland University. That included focus group across regulators, gambling treatment providers, academics and regular gamblers. Around 2,000 people were included in that aspect. That was to understand the sort of behaviours behind people's decision to gamble, what's motivating, what are they telling themselves as they make these decisions, what are they perceiving as the risk and reward proposition. So really started to unpack that. The subsequent piece of work was done with behavioural research expertise in Hall and Partners that further developed the behavioural insights with focus groups with about 104 participants and survey of another 2,500 online wagerers. That started to further unpack the types and group the types of behaviours we see. For example, a grouping called the strategy group. The strategy are folk that think they've got a method by which they could actually increase their chances of winning. Then there's other things that talk about the positive nature of what you could be doing instead of spending money on gambling. So understanding the different motivations and then what sort of taglines went to those sort of behaviours. That was around another 2,500. Then the third piece of research, which included another 2,000 people, individuals involved, starting to refine and further test those taglines. And part of that was testing whether those taglines stigmatise gambling. So there was around 30 taglines that started with before we got to the final 7.
If I could just interrupt you
Yes,
there,
certainly can.
for the people either watching this or listening online, could you just explain what a tagline is? Just a couple of examples.
Sure, certainly can.
And sorry, just before you answer, you know, Deputy Chair, that's 10 minutes, so we'll have to move on after this answer.
I've been sufficiently warned.
Just quickly, the Gamble Responsibly tagline, which comes at, currently comes at the end of an ad. So it's a little public health message or a little message that adds on to an ad mandated by government to, to give a message. So that's what a tagline is.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's correct. And so and you asked the new ones. The chances are you're about to lose. What are you gambling? What's gambling really costing you? That's the examples of the ones that are meant to be replaced. And the second part of the consultation was with industry, waging service providers, media providers to look at. Now we've got these taglines. What are the implementation concerns, logistics that need to be considered as we implement these?
Thank you.
Thank
you,
you.
Chair.
We might, Ms Miller-Frost, we've got questions. The time goes very quickly, I warn you.
Okay, I'll be quick. Just reflecting back on the gambling stats that are in the submission and that Deputy Chair just reflected on, do you have an opinion on how much of that's culture and how much of that's legislation? Like, is our international comparison, where's it sit? What's the difference?
I mean, that's a really profound question, but I think there's a couple of things. I think there is an innate kind of cultural predisposition. I remember growing up, watching, they were always talking about racing odds and things on TV as a child. It's just talked about a fair bit pervasively in the culture. I think the other thing is, we do have a federation, which means some countries where they don't have that, they have been able to, I guess, implement consistent approaches with national kind of reach more readily, whereas we are working in collaboration with states and territories to implement measures. So I think it's a kind of a combination, but I think it's, it's also a bit of a, I don't think it's widely known whether we've got the biggest losses in the world, and I think that's something, again, we were talking before about prevention and a public health approach is there's actually not a lot of, widespread community knowledge about the extent of gambling and of problem gambling.
Yeah, okay. So noting that a lot of our public health response type is very much post-crisis, so we're waiting until people have a problem before we put interventions in. Is there anything we could be doing at that more preventative level, at that changing culture community level?
I mean, I think that is what a number of stakeholders are calling for. And to go back to the parallel I was using in the domestic violence space, which I also look after, I mean, we have national campaigns like Stop It at the Start. We have an institution, Our Watch, who have their whole focus is preventative work. We work with media companies, there's strategies with sport, there's strategies in a whole range of sectors, and then in schools. So as part of the education system, there's a lot of activity now about, respectful relationships, etc. So, I mean, those are the types of activities that a preventative approach would generally look at. So, yeah.
And does anyone do that in the world? Like, is there a best practice?
I might ask my colleagues if...
Most of the, looking at international, I've seen it's been, along the lines of about restrictions in advertising or penalties for unlicensed providers, elements like that, more so than the preventative side.
Okay. Now, obviously, your legislation can only deal with the onshore legal gambling. Do we know sort of when we've got problem gamblers, if we're dealing with them, are we forcing them onto the online offshore?
So APNA do block illegal gambling, offshore gambling sites, and so they'll be able to speak to you about that. I think that's often an issue that's raised when we talk about additional restrictions on online onshore gambling. You know, people do raise the risk, I guess, that people, if they can't access a site illegally, they will go to an offshore illegal site. I don't know whether we've got a lot of evidence about that behavioural trend. Is that right, Chris?
Yeah, no, not so much in Australia. I suppose the only thing comparative was when UK introduced some further amendments. There didn't seem to be, in the interim study that they've done since banning credit cards, etc., there didn't seem to be a large shift in people moving to offshore or unlicensed gambling.
Okay, thank you. And I guess just one last question.
Sorry, just to interrupt.
Am I done?
This will be your last.
Okay,
No,
no
you're
problem.
Quickly.
In terms of the approaches that we're looking at in terms of dealing with people who do have a problem gambling, obviously those who are attending venues and you know, pokies are easier to capture than those who are basically in their bedroom at home. Is there a different approach that we need to be focusing on?
I mean, the gambling providers would know who their very heavy users are. So I think, although you're right, it's not a public activity, it would be a documented activity by the provider. So in some ways, I think, you know, that it's almost, it's more able to be kind of intercepted and an offer of help or what have you. Having said that, it is difficult. I mean, there are people who have significant gambling expenditure who do not have a gambling addiction or a gambling problem, and so it becomes a question of judgment about at what point do you kind of interrupt someone's play to say, you know, you've spent $20,000 already this week. You know, do you need to pause and reflect? I mean, I think those are the kinds of really difficult judgment calls that need to be discussed.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, sorry. I was looking at the timings. Mr. Holohan, over to you, and your time's up.
Thank you, Chair. I'll just be very brief. Did any of you watch the World Cup this morning?
Not me.
4-1, yeah. 4-1?
4-1. Yeah, it's a bit early. Like, it's still quite painful to bring that up.
Did you watch the halftime coverage on SBS? If you had, you would have seen gambling advertising on SBS. I know there are various constitutional and other restrictions on what we can do, but would you agree that when it comes to SBS, there are more levers to pull from the Commonwealth?
I mean, it's probably more a question for communications, but obviously it's a publicly funded entity, so yes.
And would you agree that at 6:45 a.m, when many families have tuned in and are maybe getting ready for school, seeing gambling advertising on a free-to-air government-funded entity, we could probably do better?
I think that the issue of gambling advertising is one that we have. We get a lot of feedback about people finding it all pervasive. People worrying about their children's exposure. So I think there is a sense as a community that's something that maybe needs further looking at.
And in the report, it says 2 of the 4 key factors influencing an intention to gamble were the marketing, advertising of gambling products, and it says in brackets, particularly sports betting. is it not the case that the Commonwealth could put conditions on its funding that include the restriction on sports gambling, or perhaps even at particular times, so we could be a model for the industry?
So there are limitations on gambling advertising, that essentially no in-play advertising between, what are the times?
It's 5:30 and 8
5:30 and 8
p.m. Yeah.
PM, but this
PM.
was 6:45 AM.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, but those are obviously open to discussion and as to whether they're sufficiently comprehensive, those restrictions, and other countries have greater restrictions.
And it's more than that. The TAB is a major sponsor, and SBS notes as an official broadcast sponsor. No further questions, Chair.
Thank you very much. Ms. Ware, over to you.
Thank you, Chair. I've just got a couple of questions as well, and thank you all for your very comprehensive report. It's very much appreciated. With the numbers that came out that said Australia has the highest gambling losses per capita in the world, was there an analysis done of whether there is a greater amount of gambling advertising in Australia as compared to other countries in the world? And I'm interested in whether there is a definite link between, and it probably also goes to the earlier question around whether this is a cultural issue for us or whether it is more legislative. So is there a link between the amount of advertising that is currently on in Australian media compared to the rest of the world when we were looking at the amount of gambling losses per capita for us?
I'm not aware that that's that there's been a causal kind of connection proven.
Yeah, there's plenty of literature out there that looks at some sort of associations with it, but in terms of a direct causal, we haven't seen a direct causal link between gambling and advertising. But I'm not aware of the research, I should say, but there is research that suggests that the more exposure to advertising, that there is associations, I suppose, with gambling harm and people's gambling behaviour.
I might just add, I was involved with this policy area many years ago, more than 20 years ago, prior to online gaming being a significant feature, and my recollection is Australia had the worst losses in the world back then, but it was largely land-based gambling. So I think, going back to your kind of question, there's something cultural in Australian culture, but then I think people are exacerbated by potentially extent of advertising. So.
Okay, and probably then if I can, that probably segues really nicely into my next question, which as the mother of teenagers who are regularly gaming far too much for my liking, we have heard in some other submissions before this committee that there is probably a causal link between online gaming, particularly with our teenagers, boys probably a little bit more so than girls, but teenagers generally, and then moving into developing perhaps gambling problems or gambling addictions a lot earlier than we've probably seen in previous generations. If, first of all, do you have any comment on that? And then secondly, if we were to develop a sort of a national framework, if this committee was to make some recommendations and develop that, would you see that as one of the priority education pieces for our secondary students and maybe even our younger Australians as well?
It's certainly an issue that's raised more and more, and I think there are different views, and I want to acknowledge there are different views, and some people consider that the kind of non-monetary games of chance in gaming are not similar. So I don't think we have a view about that, but there is obviously evidence of increasing gambling amongst young people, including people under 18, including from recent AFES research, from the longitudinal study of Australian children. So there's definitely behaviours that young people are engaged with that are high risk and putting them at risk. And so I would say any strategy would need to have an educational component. I think, you know, I don't know what the form of that would be. So one of the issues, of course, is it's an addictive behaviour, so kind of appeals to kind of rational belief don't necessarily hit the mark. So, you know, we would need to do a fair bit more work and research, I think, on what sort of educational activity you would do. But yes, I think doing something with young people would be part of a public health approach.
Okay, and just I've got one more very quick question on that, and then one more question, and then I'm done, Chair. Am I out of time?
Sorry, Ms. Ware, I'm going to say you've got one question left.
All right. Yeah, if I've got one question left.
Give it to Pat.
In terms of the credit betting restrictions that you've been talking about, how would it be possible to sort of bring in that sort of restriction when overall credit cards can be widely used on many other apps and websites? How would you see that being introduced?
So there is kind of a merchant category code for gambling, which would enable, as I understand it, banks to essentially block that merchant category code from credit cards. So this, as you know, this was examined in a lot of detail by a previous parliamentary committee, and essentially my understanding is the ABA's position was it's doable. It's they're you know, technically it's not that complex. So
Right.
yeah.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Ms. Cheney, welcome. I will turn to you and maybe just ask you to introduce yourself to the witnesses, as you didn't have the opportunity to so when we all did that earlier.
Yes, sorry about that. I'm Kate Cheney, MP from Curtin in WA, independent. I've had a constituent whose son voluntarily excluded himself and continued to be targeted. Now, they made a complaint and a penalty was applied. It seemed like a very small penalty. The mother's interpretation of that was it seemed to be a cost of doing business. What enforcement options are available to the government under BetStop to actually hold companies to account without it just being a cost of doing business?
So you're talking about offering inducements or approaching someone who's excluded themselves.
Yes.
So that will be dependent on each state and territory, if I'm right about that.
So when So when BetStop comes in, I think, and the ACMA are responsible for introducing that, and I think they've mentioned the last sent estimates that'll be early next year that will come into play. So at the moment, various states and territories have their own self-exclusion registers and apply their own penalties. When ACMA introduces BetStop next year, under the Interactive Gambling Act, there is significant penalties for wagering service providers not adhering to the requirements, and therefore people put themselves on the exclusion register and wagering service providers make contact with them. There are significant penalties. I don't have the exact numbers in front of me, but they're quite significant.
Okay, thank you. And how could BetStop prevent an individual from actually circumventing self-exclusion by registering with a different email address?
I'd have to probably leave that for ACMA in terms of the technicalities of the verification, but certainly under the Act, it's a requirement for wagering service providers to make sure that they've checked that particular person is not on the self-exclusion register or BetStop. So in terms of circumventing it with different email addresses and names, etc., I'm not sure, and that might be a bit question for ACMA.
Oh, okay. That's it from me. Thanks.
Thank you. Well, we've got about 10 minutes left. So I might just start with a follow-up question, and members who have other questions can follow on after me. But I want to start by saying, obviously, in the time we have you before us for this hearing, there is no way we can interrogate all of the information in your submission and issues. So I know I'm likely to put some questions on notice, and I suspect some of my colleagues may want to as well. So we will do that after this hearing. And some of the stuff about loot boxes and online gaming that Ms. Ware was able to just touch on, I think need more examination. So there'll be questions on notice. What I wanted to ask you though is, there's a number of submissions, and I've had civic organisations, I guess you'd call it, come to me suggesting that we look at whether there should be a national regulatory framework established which covers gambling. Obviously, we're just looking at online gambling, but much broader than the current framework. So national regulation in the vein of a public health approach, and a national regulator with stronger powers perhaps than ACMA. Is that something the department has looked at? I'm sure you're aware of the submissions and the suggestions. Are there any particular barriers to doing that? Is there anything the department has seen which argues for doing that?
So we are aware that that's something that's been called for by a number of advocates, and there was obviously legislation for a national regulator introduced some years ago, which did not proceed. So there's obviously some thought in the past has gone into how you would do that. We have not explored it in the sense of, actively seeking legal advice or constitutional advice about issues and barriers. But that is, that would be something we would need to do, I think, to properly answer your question. And, in the time I've been a public servant, the High Court has changed the rules of racing a bit about what is constitutionally possible or agreed. So there's some issues like that I think would need to be explored, which we have not explored to date. I think I would put it that way. But obviously, there's ways of kind of addressing barriers and issues that come up. If it was the Parliament's will that there be a national gambling regulator, we would obviously look and explore a range of options to make that come into effect. So. Okay, so the short version of that is has been seen as a good idea in the past, may or may not be a good idea, but you'd need to do more work on it. Correct. Yes, that's correct. Thank you. Deputy Chair, did you have any follow-up questions?
I just have one further question. Thank you, Chair. Probably directed to you, Ms. Heffron-Webb. You were asked a question about a causal link between online gaming leading to online gambling or gambling. Just take it back one step, because I've got teenage boys, particularly in your field with families. Is there any evidence of a causal link between online gaming and behavioural issues significant behavioural issues affecting families, going into domestic violence, etc., etc.?
I think it's an emerging field, so I don't think there's a lot of kind of really robust evidence that I have seen. It is certainly something parents raise as a major concern, not just the gamification, if you will, but the the isolation, the spending a lot of time at home playing games. I think it's something that is of great concern to a number of parents. Overseas, I think there's been some, the phenomenon has, in Japan, I think, kind of reached a point where there's kind of almost a crisis level around it. But as to whether, there's a lot of research, I don't think there's a lot of research in the Australian context. And it's an area that, I think is going to keep emerging as something we need to be working on.
Yeah. Thank you for that. It's probably outside the terms of reference, Chair, but I just...
It's a concern. It's a concern.
That's all.
That's okay. You've got a benevolent chair, no problem. Ms. Miller-Frost.
No for me. Thank you.
Okay, Ms. Cheney.
I'm sure I'll have some questions on notice, but nothing more at the moment. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, can I just ask a question I should have asked, just so that we get it on the record? When the department talks about harm from gambling, and somewhere I've got here a statistic, here it is, that 39% of online gamblers experience some harm. What do you mean by harm? What is that?
I think there's a kind of an official tool that defines that. I might ask Mr. D'Souza.
So usually when we talk about harm, Chair, usually anything that's could be financial related has some, the actions had some impact, or it might be a family situation or people's own mental health, etc. So it's sort of a broad encompassing where they've identified that their actions has had some impact on either themselves personally, their finances, or their broader family. Or there's a tool that people use, the PGSI, the Problem Gambling. Sorry, forgive me, what the S and the I instrument, whether you self-administer. You can look at it at gambling online. You can self-administer and to see what your actions and your amount of gambling, what that sort of impact, and it'll give you a score, a sense of where you might sit in terms of problem gambling or at risk or your fine, etc.
Right. So it's essentially if someone identifies or uses a tool to identify that their use of online gambling is having a negative effect in some way.
That's a good way of summarising it, Chair, yes.
Okay. Thank you. And the department submission, just turning very briefly back to the gaming and the loot boxes and simulated gambling, that there may be a need for legislative change of the definition of online gambling and other legislative measures. Does the department have specific suggestions, not necessarily that you have to put forward now, but that can be put forward about those changes which may need to be made?
I don't think we do, Chair. The Interactive Gambling Act is the responsibility of Department of Communications. So, and they of course have the eSafety Commissioner as an agency under their department. It's an issue I think she has some thoughts about, but it's not something where we've got to any kind of consensus or discussion about specific legislative amendments, but they may be able to provide more than us. Yeah.
Thank you. We might ask either or both of them. When we come back to gambling advertising, there's obviously, particularly in sport, a version of advertising which is through sponsorship of sporting clubs or entire codes, which includes the sponsorship being on jumpers and displayed around the fields, which obviously gets picked up on the television during the time when there's a ban on online gambling advertising. is it something sorry, let me ask it this way. It seems to me that there's two options. One would be to ban sponsorship in a way that happened with tobacco and alcohol, or to look at saying sponsorship can continue, but that form of advertising can't go ahead if it is to appear on television. Are either of those possibilities, the third one's to do nothing, but are either of those possibilities within the Commonwealth's jurisdiction? You can take it on notice if you need to.
Yeah.
Chair, I was going to say the only place we've dipped into that is with the recent advice on the messaging and the taglines, whereas we've the guidance has been if there is any form of with Gamble Responsibly currently appears, the guidance is that's where it's meant to be replaced, but industry did seek some guidance on the requirements with regard to whether a stadium's called Ladbroke Stadium, do we require the tagline there? The guidance has been only where it's already stated Gamble Responsibly on it, and that would go for a jumper as well. So we're not, at the moment, the framework doesn't require unless the sponsorship does currently include Gamble Responsibly or is required to include it. And that's probably the only place we've dipped into that. Yep.
Well, thank you. Well, I might ask you to take my question on notice, and when you read the Hansard, if it's not clear enough what I was asking about those alternative scenarios, just let me know and I'll put something in writing. I see the time is 5:01 and I took up the end of the time with those extra questions, so thank you very much. I want to thank you all for your attendance here today, and you have been asked to provide some additional information. I'd ask if you could forward it to the Secretary by the 7th of December 2022, and as I said, you might anticipate some further questions on notice. You will be sent a copy of the transcript of your evidence and will have an opportunity to request corrections to transcription errors. Thank you. Thank you, colleagues. I declare this public hearing closed.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity.